Hello, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to another edition of Mr. Merrigan's Moments in History. Today, we are going to talk about what brings us to the end of the American Civil War. And so when we look at our learning target for today, we're going to be able to describe the events that led to the end of the Civil War. And we'll talk about the efforts that Grant's army and Sherman's army played in that role, and eventually get ourselves to the image that you guys saw at the beginning and in the background here of Appomattox Courthouse, where the war officially comes to an end. So as we talk today, we're kind of going to be talking about two distinct areas. We're talking about this area here in Northern Virginia and taking place mostly in Virginia. This is between Grant and Lee. And then we're also going to talk about the kind of the deeper South, getting into the Carolinas, as well as, of course, the importance of cities like Atlanta a little bit later. But this will be where we see more of Sherman's contribution to the war. So, after a very long and bloody summer in the year of 1864, the Union forces are finally able to capture some of these important Confederate strongholds, and as a result, Lincoln is going to win re-election. We're going to go more into depth on that in a second, but the re-election of Lincoln is very important for the country at the end of the Civil War and at the beginning of Reconstruction. So let's look at these two parts. Okay, the plan was to have Grant, who's now been appointed as the general for the entire Union Army, but he's focused mostly on fighting in the East. His plan was to have Lincoln's plan again was to have Grant and then the Eastern Army crush Lee's army in Virginia. That being the commander of the Confederate troops and able to perhaps even achieve that last goal of taking Richmond, which is of course going to be needed in order for Grant to get Lee's surrender. Now the other part of this is more in that, again, southern part, in the Western Army, who's going to be led by Sherman. So again, Grant is going to lead the eastern part, or the Army of the Potomac, and then Tecumseh Sherman is going to rise up to lead the Western Army, and he's going to advance to places like Atlanta, and then also later to Savannah, in what's called Sherman's March to the Sea, which you can see down here. And the goal there is to crush the Confederates in the Deep South. So those are kind of the two layers as we head into today. So in 1864, Lincoln decides to push for General Ulysses S. Grant to be in charge of the Union armies. Remember, his goal again, or his nickname, I should say, was Unconditional Surrender Grant. Okay, Lincoln says of him, "I can't spare this man. He fights." One of the things that Lincoln wasn't getting from his previous generals, whether it was Burnside or McClellan or others, is none of them took the fighting to the Confederacy as much as Grant was willing to. Now, again, one of the big criticisms of Grant as a general is that he gave up a lot of men in order to get those results. So let's look at Grant for a second. We should note that Grant, in many things that he had tried in his life, was a failure. Remember when we highlighted earlier about Grant is he wasn't a great student, but he was able to get a spot at West Point, and eventually, again, was able to build a military career for himself, and he's going to be able to take that career all the way to the presidency later. So in May and June 1864, Grant's army is able to battle with Lee's troops in a series of extremely bloody battles. The Wilderness Campaign is what those battles were referred to as, resulting in large casualties on both sides. Not Gettysburg numbers, but certainly you can see that these are very high-cost victories for the Confederacy. Grant's finally able to lay siege to Petersburg for about 9 months, which cuts off Confederate troops and supplies, and is going to be extremely important on putting kind of Lee in a tough situation and eventually going to lead to his surrender. So once Grant is able to defeat Lee at Petersburg, he is then able to march into Richmond. He's able to conquer the Confederate capital. So all three pieces now of the Anaconda Plan against the Confederacy have been achieved. The Union has been able to cut off these ports. The Union has been able to control the Mississippi, and now they've been able to conquer Richmond. All that is left is to get the surrender. And so here's where the Southern campaign comes in, or the Deep South campaign comes in, or what we would call the Western Front still. Union General William Tecumseh Sherman is tasked with trying to win some important victories and to try to break the will of the Confederacy. And we're going to talk about his tactic called total war here in a second. But he attacks Atlanta, Georgia, and he faced major resistance from the Confederate General John Hood. And in September, Hood eventually abandons the city, and Sherman's able to take it, and essentially he almost entirely burns Atlanta to the ground. So Sherman's deliberate destruction of large parts of the South is a tactic that's known as total war, which is a war on all aspects of an enemy's life. So you're not just attacking and destroying parts of the army or their supply chains. You are destroying farms. You're destroying infrastructure. And the strategy is deliberate in order to bring the horrors of the war to the Southern people. In fact, one of the tactics that they would do as they were destroying railroads is they didn't want the Confederacy to be able to continue to use them. So they would take the railroad ties, which are the wood that's underneath a railroad track, build a fire with it. They would leave the rails over the center until they were warm enough, where they were more malleable, and they would literally bend them around trees, which became known as Sherman neckties. And so you're literally seeing total destruction of the South in order to break the will of the Southern people in continuing to support this war. General Sherman and his troops essentially, they burn Atlanta and they begin this trail of destruction, again known as Sherman's March to the Sea, and they're making their way first to Savannah here in Georgia, and then eventually they're going to make their way up to Bentonville and again into Raleigh, North Carolina. Want to read this description. This is from a diary from Dolly Summer Lunt, who is referring to these tactics and their effects on people in the South and the Confederacy. Sleepless nights. The report is that the Yankees have left Covington for Macon to release prisoners held there. They robbed every house on the road of its provisions, sometimes taking every piece of meat, blankets, and wearing apparel, silver, and arms of every description. They would take silk dresses and put them under their saddles, and many other things for which they had no use, in this way to make us love them and their union? Let the poor people answer whom they have deprived of every mouthful of meat and their livestock to make any. Our mills, too, have been burned, destroying an immense amount of property. Sherman's tactics were designed to cripple the South's economy, which had already been on its last legs, as a way to force the Confederacy into surrender. Because again, Lincoln's goal, and eventually after the taking of Atlanta, that gives a big boost to Lincoln's reelection. It gives Lincoln what he needs, kind of the incentive, the approval that he needs to take this to the end. So again, what's the object of the destruction described here? It's to break the will of the people to try to push the Confederacy to surrender. So as we kind of continue that total war, we mentioned David Farragut. He's the one who took New Orleans. He's the highest ranking officer in the Union Navy. He then takes and blocks off Mobile Bay, which would be located right here in Alabama. That's the last port east of the Mississippi that was open for trade. So the Anaconda Plan of the blockade was fully realized at this point in 1864, and that took place between August 2nd and August 23rd, which had already been massively crippled, but now it's official, and the last really major port was taken. So when we look at it, all three phases have been achieved now with the taking of Richmond. So for the most part, 1864, right? There's a large opposition to the war. And this was, again, earlier, and this is before the taking of Atlanta. And so the opposition to the war in the North began to grow. And in many ways, the presidential election, which was coming in November, it kind of looked unlikely that Lincoln was going to get reelected. But all of that changes with some of these victories. And in fact, in some ways, Sherman was sending kind of a major present to Lincoln by taking Atlanta. Congress also was pushing for peace with the South, but Lincoln again wanted to put an end to the Civil War, and he really wanted to end slavery forever. And so with his reelection, he's going to be able to do that. So with that important Union victories at Atlanta and Petersburg, the support for Lincoln won him just enough to win re-election in 1864 over his former general, George McClellan. Lincoln interpreted, aka he explained, the meaning of his re-election as a very clear sign for the voters to end slavery permanently. And so on January 31st, 1865, Congress very narrowly passed the 13th Amendment, which again banned slavery in the United States except as punishment for a crime, which it still stands as today, which is a whole nother issue that we could certainly do an entire video on. But the 13th Amendment, extremely important, and again, ending slavery was what the war had become about. And the 13th Amendment, of course, is probably one of the most important accomplishments that Lincoln was able to help get pushed through Congress. Lincoln wins his re-election, and in his second inaugural address, he says, "With malice towards none, with charity for all, with firmness in the right, as God gives us to see the right, let us strive on to finish the work we are in, to bind up the nation's wounds, to care for him who shall have borne the battle, and for his widow and his orphan, to do all which may achieve and cherish a just and lasting peace among ourselves and with all nations." So when we look at this, we kind of break it down. With malice towards none and charity for all. In his speech, he's saying that we can't have any malice towards the Confederacy as part of being part of the Union at this point. And there needs to be charity for all. We need to, when this war is over, we need to come back together. He also says to bind the nation's wounds. He knows that when this war is over, the Confederacy isn't going to be happy about it. The southern states aren't going to be excited to join the Union. But in order for this country to move forward, that's what it's going to take, is the binding of those wounds. And so you can see here Lincoln giving his speech before a pretty crowded crowd out to see him. So which amendment banned banned slavery in the United States? Is it the 13th, the 14th, the 15th, or the 16th? Take a moment, pause if you need to, think about it. But when you're ready to answer, go ahead and push play again. Correct answer here, of course, is the 13th Amendment, which ended slavery again in all situations except for punishment as a crime. We've come to it. We've come to the end, and when we look at kind of how we're getting here, we've seen some battles on like the High Ridge as well as the Cumberland Church, and we've seen Grant and Lee kind of chasing each other, along with, of course, some of their other officers. And we end up here at the home of Wilmer McLean. Wilmer McLean has an interesting story. His home was just outside the battle. In fact, it was practically in his backyard at the first Battle of Bull Run. And he wanted nothing to do with the war. He wanted to escape it. And so he moved his family to Appomattox Courthouse, which was this quiet town in Virginia. And he gets a knock on his front door, and they would like to use his home, in particular his front parlor, to sign the surrenders. And so in some ways, Wilmer McLean can kind of say that his experience in the Civil War kind of began practically in his backyard, and it ended in his front parlor. And so the formal end of the war comes on April 9th, 1865, in the town of Appomattox Courthouse, which again is in Virginia. And it's here that you see the signing of the surrender papers and eventually Lee surrendering his sword to Grant. These two men have a lot of admiration for each other, and it should be noted that Lee still has the respect of Grant as well as the Union Army, and so even in defeat, there is that mutual respect for one another. So when we look at this war, it should be noted we've had over 620 soldiers die in the American Civil War, and the economic toll, particularly on the South, is devastating. So moving forward, as we head into Reconstruction, it's going to become important for us to see that impact, and you're going to see it play out as we get to the rebuilding of our country. So the North's victory, the Union's victory, saved the Union, and it in turn freed millions of African Americans because the 13th Amendment had been put in place. So just to review, where was the capital of the Confederacy? Was it in Raleigh, North Carolina, Montgomery, Alabama, Atlanta, Georgia, or Richmond, Virginia? Pause if you need to. Think about it. But the answer here is Richmond. And again, that was the last part of the essential Anaconda Plan. Just want to show you guys this. So military losses in American War, as you can see, 620,000 continues to be the highest total number. One thing we have to keep in mind with these numbers, every casualty is American. Okay, but certainly you can see the deadliness of this war and the impact that it's going to have for generations on the United States. World War II is next, followed by World War I. One of the reasons World War I is lower, because both World War I and the Civil War technology was so much more advanced than the tactics that it actually led to extreme high levels of death. But part of the reason why it's lower for the United States is we get into that war much later. And then you've got, of course, Vietnam, Korea, Revolutionary War, War of 1812, Mexican-American War, and then you're getting into like Iraq and Afghanistan, more modern war, and then even much less in like the Spanish-American War, which will come later in history, and then the Gulf War. So numbers of the Civil War, again, were not equaled by any of these. And some believe that this number is too low. Some people believe that it's as high as 850,000. The Civil War Trust doesn't necessarily agree with that claim. And so certainly the ruin of this war, like you can see the physical damage here at the time, was over 2.3 million for the Confederacy, and both the cost for both, we're talking about almost $1.5 million for the Union, and we're talking over $1 million to help pay for this. And again, this is a large amount of money for this time period. So that is where we're going to wrap up today. Thank you for listening. For my students, make sure you've been following along with the guided notes. And again, that's going to wrap up the Civil War. So I hope that you have been able to kind of gain a little bit better understanding of the impact of the war here, and we'll get more into that in Reconstruction, certainly, as we continue. Have a wonderful day, and thank you so much for listening.